First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So just a quick note on seminar logistics. All of the seminars will be recorded, as you know. All participants will be muted with their cameras off. Questions shall be asked through the chat only. Send your questions to the person named Send Questions here anytime if you want. And awesome. We have one more upcoming seminar in our series after this. That's on December 8th. It's a paying for post-secondary seminar. It'll also be hosted by Sam. And you can check out any of our previous seminars on our YouTube channel. There's a link there if you are interested. So without any further ado, I will present our guest speaker today. I'm excited to present Sam from Wealthsimple.
Thanks, Dashel. As Dashel mentioned, my name's Sam. I'm a software engineer at Wealthsimple, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to do a brief presentation on what budgeting is and budgeting 101. Thanks, Dashel. So just an intro to the Wealthsimple Foundation to kick things off. Next slide. Thanks. So the Wealthsimple's mission, or Wealthsimple Foundation's mission, is to enable a brighter future for everyone in Canada through access to post-secondary. So our mission and our goal is to help 100,000 children by 2023 and 1 million children by 2030 to apply for the Canada Learning Bond. We also focus on delivering financial literacy webinars like this to youth, students, and their families in the community. And we also help families with their tax returns, opening RESP accounts, and any other relevant work that needs to be done to get them set up for post-secondary. So as I mentioned, some of our 2030 goals are to educate 5 million people through tax clinics and personal finance education, enroll 1 million children through in the Canada Learning Bond benefit, and to sponsor 1,000 students to complete their post-secondary education. But our goal today is to deliver some information on budgeting and to hopefully equip everyone with some simple tools and fundamentals to empower you all to make some smart personal finance decisions. So let's get into it. Let's ask ourselves, what is budgeting? So a budget is a plan for using your money over a defined period of time. So in a perfect world, we'd have access to all the money we'd need or we'd want when we'd want it, but that's not always realistic. So it's really important to start thinking about how we can create a budget so that we have the money that we need for the most important things in our life. And when we talk about budgeting, I know, especially for me, when I first started out thinking about budgeting, it was a little bit daunting. I wasn't really sure where to start or what things I should be using to prioritize what needed to be spent first. So these are also some other sentiments that we were hearing from other folks that, you know, it can be kind of scary. Folks don't really know if they're doing it right. Maybe they've had issues with budgeting in the past. So let's talk about some simple tools that we can use to look at prioritizing our budget. So in the past, you know, you may have heard of budgets where you have to track every single penny and focus on making sure that absolutely everything that we spend our money on is tracked. And while that can be really helpful for some people, that's not necessarily an approach that works for everybody. So we've got an approach that we'd like to share today that has a lot of people have found very helpful. So the first thing that we like to take a look at when we look at our monthly budget is our fixed expenses. And so fixed expenses are things that we have to pay every month. So maybe that's our TTC pass, our phone bill, our internet bill, our Spotify bill, essentially things that while the amount might change slightly month to month, that bill is coming in whether we like it or not. The next thing we look at is meaningful savings and paying down debt. So for me, you know, I'm hoping to buy a new car in the next year or so. So that's a goal that I can think about putting a certain amount of money per month into my savings towards this goal. So that's really meaningful savings for me. So for you, that might be an Xbox, or maybe you're going on a trip that you really want to save up for. And when we think about debt, that could be a credit card payment, but it also could be that, you know, you've borrowed money from a friend when you're out for dinner and forgot your wallet, because I've definitely done that before. And so it's important to think about these debt payments as an important piece in our budget as well. Thirdly, we think about spending money. So this is the fun stuff. This is what's left over after paying our bills and putting money in savings and paying off debt. So this might be day-to-day spending. It might be going out for dinner with friends. You know, we just had Black Friday, Cyber Monday. I bought a pair of winter boots. So that was coming out of my fun spending money. So this is, yeah, the leftover money after the really important pieces. And the last piece is other savings. So maybe we know that we want to be saving for other things in the future, but we don't necessarily have a specific goal in mind. It's always important to think about whatever is left after spending the fixed expenses, savings, and spending money, putting it into longer term savings. So it's not a bad thing to be, you know, net positive at the end of the month. So let's take a look at this in practice. We'll give you an example here. Let's take a look at Alicia. So Alicia is 18 years old. She works part-time at a retail store. She makes minimum wage. She works about 12 to 15 hours a week, and her take-home pay at the end of the month is roughly $750 a month. And Alicia has several competing priorities. So Alicia's a student. She also helps watch her siblings. And she wants to spend some time with friends. So it's really important for Alicia to know what to do with her money each month when she has these competing priorities. So when we look at Alicia's expenses, we've kind of got a list of a bunch of expenses here. Now, all of these expenses might seem like fixed expenses, meaning, you know, oh, these have to be paid this month. But in reality, there's only a handful of these that are actually fixed expenses. Next slide, thank you. So when you look at Alicia's expenses, the ones that are really the most important every month is the phone bill, because she has to pay that. Her TTC pass, again, she has to pay that. Spotify is a bill, and she has to feed herself. So in total, these bills add up to $245. On top of that, Alicia wants to spend, you know, $50 into an emergency fund. That's meaningful savings for her because she doesn't want to be caught in an emergency situation with no money. And as a side note, emergency funds are a really great way to save some money if you don't have a specific goal for it, but you still want to have some savings there. And a lot of Visa debit cards and your banks can actually help you with roundup programs. So if you're looking at maybe trying to make it easier to save for these things, I would recommend looking into some of these roundup programs with your bank. And then Alicia has some spending money. So now she wants to kind of figure out what she wants to do with some spending money. So she makes $750 a month. She has $245 coming out in expenses. She has an emergency fund of $50, and she has long-term savings of $200 that she already was thinking about adding if it's within her budget. So it looks like it is within her budget, and she has $255 left over at the end of the month. So those personal care and going out expenses that were originally put in the first card here, that total $230, we weren't sure at the beginning of the month if Alicia could afford to be spending on personal care and going out, but after looking through her budget, it looks like that $230 really does fit well into her monthly budget. And she can have her $200 in savings and still have $25 left over at the end of the month. So I would encourage all of you to try doing some budgeting for yourself. We can provide this deck, but we can also provide a few resources afterwards, including a budgeting template that would recommend you take a look at and maybe start plugging in some of your own expenses and income to get a better idea of what a budget might look like for you and what things are important for you when you're looking at what you spend every month, especially looking at going towards post-secondary. Those things can be really important because you might have a bunch of different pieces of income from OSAP or a scholarship, and it's important to make sure that we are spending that money where we need it first. And again, we'll send over some of these resources after the presentation. So I'm going to pass it back over to Dashiell.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. That was awesome. All right. I'm going to introduce myself quickly. I'm Dashiell. I go by he, him pronouns. I work on our team's business and CNC team, and I'm going to give a brief presentation on how budgeting relates to robotics. So it's going to consist of 3 parts. We're going to go over income, effectively, how that'll go into your budget, season costs, how you should look at those, how you should break them down, what you should consider to be the most important. And we'll talk briefly about savings and future investments that you can carry over in between seasons. So we'll start off by talking briefly about sponsorships and grants. So sponsors are going to be your best option when it comes to funding your robotics team. When you go out to acquire sponsors, it's important to consider having a range of packages that they can fulfill for you. So considering what kind of values you can offer for different price points, having maybe bigger sponsors be like prominent on your merch, having relationships with them like we've done with Wealthsimple, where you work on seminar series or promote parts of your team with them. And then it's also important to consider when you're looking for sponsors, what kinds of things that they can bring to your team. So we're going to talk more about robot costs and parts that are essential later, but a lot of sponsors have certain specialties and things that they'll be able to provide that are valuable. So you might want to consider looking for sponsors specifically for metal, computers, or other parts, as they'll be able to provide those things to you at a wholesale value instead of giving them to you at a markup. So it can be more valuable than just getting the money in certain circumstances. For more information on sponsorship acquisition and grants, we've done 2 seminars on those already, which are available on our YouTube channel, as was mentioned earlier. Another option that is important to consider for income and money coming in for your team is having an initiation fee for new members. This is something that we currently do, and it's useful in that it gives you a small amount of money that you can use for your day-to-day operations. It's important that the fee should be relatively small, around $20 to $250, as ultimately it's personal and you don't want to scare people away from joining the team. Additionally, it's important that special consideration is given to those who can't afford to pay the fee, as people being on the team is far more valuable than the money that they spend to be on it, and you always want to be able to include as many people as possible. It's a good idea to offer some incentive for paying this fee. So what we do at our team is we give a t-shirt and a place in the yearbook. Those things are nice for people who join, just to kind of feel like, okay, they're getting something for paying the fee. It's a bit of an incentive. Another income source that's worth considering is merch sales. So merch can be a tool that can be used to generate revenue. However, it can be a bit difficult to get that to work properly, and it's one that requires a lot of planning, time, and effort to make sure that you're not going to take in more merch than you're going to be able to sell. At our team, we don't necessarily sell merch for profit a lot of the time. We just sell it within the team to cover our costs for doing it, just to make sure that everyone gets some, but it can be a source of income for you and your team if that's something you're interested in. It's important to consider that you're fitting demand. So if you want to keep it internally within your team, check for the demand prior to ordering the merch to ensure that you're not going to order more than you need. Another, I guess, income source that's specifically kind of unique that a lot of other teams, at least as far as I can tell, haven't really mentioned, but it's one that we use, is FlipGive. Now, FlipGive is pretty good. It allows parents to purchase gift cards, or other team members as well, or people related to the team. Anyone can do it, but effectively it allows them to purchase gift cards, and a small percentage of that purchase goes back to the team. This basically just means people can buy everyday things, and some of the money goes to the team. It's a nice thing for us, and anyone can kind of use it and contribute without having to spend extra money. Another interesting point about FlipGive is that it provides a leaderboard with like specifically how much each person has donated using it. So it kind of creates a bit of a competition type environment with incentives for using it more often. And now we'll go over briefly some of the costs of running a robotics team and effectively what you should consider for them. So we have 3 types of costs that are important to consider. The first one that should be the most prominent in your consideration is team costs. So this includes fixed rates for competitions and includes the effective human cost of running a robotics team. The next one's the robot cost and equipment costs. So effectively all the components, the metal, everything that you need to build and run a robot in a season. And finally, we have flexible costs / investments. These are kind of things that are nice to have if you can get them, but are ultimately non-essential for general operations on the team. So to start off with team season costs, these are the fees that your team are going to have to front in order to compete each year. The first one and the most obvious is competition fees. This will generally include the kit of parts. It can range from a lot of different prices depending on what you include with what you're ordering at the start of the season, but ultimately it does end up being very expensive each year. You'll also have to consider having space. Not every team is associated with schools, so if you're working privately, you may want to consider kind of where you're going to work and the amount that you're spending on that space. For competitions, you're going to have to consider transporting the robot, transporting people, and transporting effectively your whole team, because if you can't go to compete, there's no real point in building a robot. Usually with those types of costs, we have people pay for them individually, so it's not coming out of our team's budget directly, but it's important to go through and understand exactly what you're paying for and plan effectively before going through and having everyone go on these trips, because you want to make sure that you're giving everyone the most bang for their buck effectively. Another important thing to consider is food, human resources, and amenities. So during the season every year, particularly during the 8 weeks of build season, people are staying until 8 to 10 p.m. every night, and they're not going to make it home for dinner most of the time. So you need to consider having food for those people. Usually we use parent volunteers because they're able to provide healthier options than just pizza, than ordered food directly, and it's cheaper for the team that way too. But there will probably come a time where you'll have to pay directly for food for the team and order it, and that should be considered. I think it's a good rule of thumb to consider that you're probably going to have to do it because you don't necessarily know how the parent volunteers are going to come through, but it's all important. And ultimately, without this stuff, you won't be able to even get your robot to the competition. So it all comes prior in consideration to that. So the next important thing to consider is the robot material costs and effectively all of the technical components that you're going to need in order to build and run your robot each season. So ultimately, the first consideration will be your complex parts. This includes like robo-reos, PCPs, pneumatics. The robo-reo and the PCP are important things for electrical. The robo-reos effectively the computer that runs the robot. Now, the nice thing about a lot of these components is they tend to be a one-time fee. You kind of get them and you're able to reuse them in between seasons, as ultimately they do make newer Robo-Rios, but the upcoming iterations don't tend to change much in between seasons. However, a lot of components like wheels, motors, and electrical parts will wear out and have to be replaced each year. It's just important to kind of consider that first, because those are going to be your most important core pieces to having a robot each year. I would say the next most important thing is your tools. Obviously, you won't be able to build a robot without tools. So this includes power tools, nuts, bolts, screwdrivers, Allen keys, all the works effectively. Similar to complex parts, these will be reusable, and there's going to be a bigger upfront cost, but ultimately they will stay around for a while, and you'll be able to go back and use them. I think not everything in that category is like that, though. Nuts and bolts, you'll have to replace every season. Rivets, lots of things are a one-time use component, and ultimately, though it does go down, it's still something that has to be factored in every year. And the biggest one, metal and materials. This is something that will probably be reused, or won't be reused every season, as ultimately metal that we use and components that we make for a robot are very specific for each year and each game. And as a result of that, ultimately, they can't be reused. Certain components like belly panels and gear shafts may be reusable, but ultimately, at the end of the day, they're going to be too specific. So spending money on metal and materials is something that's going to have to come around every season. So after that, we will talk briefly about flexible costs / future investments if you have room for them in your budget. So with merch, ultimately, you're going to need some kind of merch so your team can represent itself at competitions. It's important for team spirit. It's important for people to feel like their team matters and they can promote themselves with it. But not all merch is essential. Ultimately, you probably just need a shirt. Anything past that, you want to make sure that you have the demand to fit it. You don't necessarily need hats. You don't need gloves. You don't need everything, because not everyone's going to need that. But it can be nice to have those things. And if people want them and you have the time, it's a nice extra consideration that can go into your budget. I would say software licenses are another flexible cost. Now, we're lucky we're in the TDSB. Our school board provides SolidWorks for us, but ultimately, certain design software or CADing software and different types of software are going to cost you a lot of money to use them if you're not getting them for free. As such, they're free alternatives to these things. They're not quite as good, but really, you don't need to go out and spend for a bunch of licenses. If you can get a few, it's kind of good enough, and it should be considered an extra cost at the end of the day. I grouped in with that the Adobe suite of applications, just because media, I would say as a whole, is something that most teams kind of grow into over time. It's not something that's directly important at the start. Ultimately, media is something that's very important for promoting your team and getting sponsors. But ultimately, if the goal is to just go and compete, then it's an extra thing that ultimately has a bit of a cost on its own. Now, cameras, the applications and everything, if people have them on their own and they want to do it, that's great. But if you're looking at spending for that as a team, that's going to cost a fair bit. Computers, extra rentable space, same sort of thing. You only need a few computers. You don't need to go overboard with them. You will need some, but you don't need a ton. Having more is useful. So if it's in the budget, it's something that you can get. Extra game pieces and prototyping. This is something that I think is very useful to invest in if there's the extra room or allocation in the budget, as ultimately in your first few seasons, you might only be able to accomplish certain tasks and games. But once you have more money for prototyping with materials and are able to get every single kind of prototype of a game piece from first, then you can start working on different mechanisms to accomplish more tasks in a given year. Another prototyping thing that our team does specifically that's useful, if the budget allows, is building a practice bot. Practice bot can be a useful tool for people on the drive team to practice with, as ultimately running your robot every season is going to take a toll on it, and it'll slowly wear it down the more time you run it. So having a practice bot will allow people to put in more hours practicing driving without risking the longevity of your primary robot. Just a couple more final investments / flexible costs. CNC, extremely expensive. It's not affordable for the most part unless you can find specific ways to get it. But if you can, it's very useful to be able to make custom components, machine metal specifically, polycarb, just effectively make a lot of parts of your robot in-house versus having to order them pre-made from other companies. It gives you a lot of tools to just prototype and make custom components throughout a season. If you can find a way to get it, it's useful, but it's pretty low on the list of priorities overall. I would also say investing in better tools, if there's more budget allocation, is worth it. Ultimately, there's a wide range of available tools that you can get, and the higher end ones will last you longer and ultimately are worth the extra money if that's something that can be afforded. I think the most important thing before anything else, though, is to contribute to an emergency fund. This is effectively essential, in my opinion, with any extra budget, as ultimately a lot of stuff breaks in first. Components, tools, parts of the robot, the whole robot, everything can break at any given time. It can happen in competition, it can happen in testing. You never know when it's going to happen. You need to make sure that you're able to fix it when it comes up. So contributing to an emergency fund, just taking a certain percentage of your income, putting it away, making sure that that's there, is going to pay dividends in the long run. So yeah, that's the budgeting portion as it pertains to robotics section of this presentation done. We'll take some questions now. I have some here, and I'll just begin. So, question for you, Sam, here. If you're not great at following rules, how do you make budgeting easier for yourself? So if you're having just problems allocating funds, what's a good way to start and build up that kind of motivation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that's like a really common one that, you know, a lot of us have experienced, especially when we have like a lot of competing priorities that all seem to be really important. And I think the nice thing about budgeting is it doesn't need to be perfect, especially to start off with. Any progress towards taking a look at monthly income and monthly expenses is a step in the right direction. So I'd say like just even starting out to understand how much is coming in each month, and at the very least, just understanding your fixed expenses, things that have to be paid every month as non-negotiables is a really great way to start. And then working towards understanding what is working for you, because all of these processes or everybody might understand this slightly differently, and it might not be a perfect fit for everyone. So trying a few things out, again, like focusing on the most important things first, and then kind of going from there. There are a lot of other like really great apps out there, so would encourage you to take a look and see if something else works for you. But again, some of those resources that will be sent in the presentation, the budgeting template is a really good place to start, especially if it hasn't really worked well for you in the past and you just want to get things down on paper and just start to understand more of a general view of what your finances look like, whether it's personal finances or your team's finances for your robotics team. Just a tool to use to get things a bit more transparent.
Awesome, thank you. Another question here, is investing a form of saving?
It can be, yeah. I would say investing is, instead of it being a form of saving, it's kind of what you do with your savings. So saving in the more general sense is just making sure that money is put aside for something in the future. Now, whether that is saving in your savings account, or maybe you have a piggy bank, or all of that is savings. Now, if you take that money out of your piggy bank and then put it into an investment, that is just something you're doing with your savings to maybe get higher earnings off of that. Now, keeping in mind that like a lot of investing is not accessible to people who are under the age of 18. So, other forms of savings and savings accounts might be a bit more useful. But I would say investing is if you have the opportunity to use it, is a way that you could use your savings to get higher yields in certain senses.
Awesome. And just one more here. If my grandparents were to give me $100 for my birthday, which category should I put the money into? And should I consider breaking it down into multiple portions?
That's a great question. And I think when you're having money coming in, any of that is income. So whether you're getting a regular paycheck from your part-time job, whether you're getting an allowance from your parents, or you're getting a birthday gift that you know is going to come in that month, that all goes into the starting point of your budget. That just might mean that your budget this month starts $100 higher. So I would focus on just like putting that into that income budget to start, or sorry, that income bucket to start. And then, if you had $750 every month before and your grandparents give you $100 this month, now this month starts with $850. Then you can kind of work down from there.
Awesome, thank you. I'll take a question here for me. Which items on the flexible list of investments should we prioritize? So I would say, in my personal opinion, taking the money, if you have extra money, first of all, always the emergency fund is the most important. Make sure that you have enough to cover everything in case it breaks. Anything can break, everything can break. Past that, I would say taking money for tools, better tools. Anything that you can kind of improve upon that you're using is important. I would say getting more computers, making sure that you have the best available software for CADing, and just anything like that is going to be important too. And then I would kind of finally say like making sure that you have the stuff available for prototyping so that you can test designs prior to like implementing them on your robot. It's going to really help as well. Here, I'll take another question here. Can we save money on our robot by reusing parts from other previous robots? So yeah, that's something you can definitely do with some things, but it's not going to work with every part of your robot. So things like the complex parts that I mentioned earlier, like the RoboRio PCP, certain electrical parts, wheels, certain motors, things like that, gearboxes too, pneumatics, that stuff can be taken in between seasons. Although you want to be generally careful, you want to kind of keep track of the degradation of those components, because a lot of the motors and stuff will tend to wear out over time and won't be reusable. I would also say that a lot of teams will donate old parts after they're done using them, when they still have some life in them. So if you're looking for parts that are useful or that you're not able to afford necessarily, then you can definitely kind of look at what teams are getting rid of, ask them if they have any extra components. First is a really great community in that people are very willing to help one another, and ultimately you can get a lot of stuff that way. Let's see here. Just another question for you here, Sam. How might someone go about deciding if a monthly expense is essential or not?
Again, I think that really depends on your individual circumstance. So for some people, some expenses might be a higher priority than others. When we think of fixed expenses or the highest priority expenses, we like to think of things that have to be paid that month. So when you think about that expense, does it need to be paid that month, or is it, you know, more of an optional expense? Is it like, you know, okay, I want to go get my nails done this month. If I go to get my nails done, I have to pay that bill because I'm there, but me choosing to go and get my nails done is an option. So that is not necessarily something that I have to spend my money on, but it would be more of something that is going to be after I account for all of my fixed expenses and my savings, et cetera. But something like my cell phone bill, that bill is coming in whether I like it or not. It's going to be coming in the mail or coming my email or maybe taken directly out of my account. So I have to make sure that I have the money there for that bill. So I think depending on your individual situation, that might look a little bit different. So it's really more about thinking about what things must be paid this month or what things would like to be paid this month, but don't necessarily have to be.
Awesome. I'll take one more question here. How do we use wood to prototype? So wood is effective in that directly after you kind of know what the game is during kickoff, when at the start of the season, wood can be used to make very basic versions of components. Take a climber, for example. If there's a climbing game that year, you can put together a simple climber with some hooks and some components very easily, very quickly, and that way you kind of just understand what you're looking at, and then you can go into more detail and make the mechanisms. One example of that we did a couple of years back in 2020 was there was a shooter that year in a shooting game. So you shoot balls, you use a flywheel system. We used wood and a bent piece of polycarb combined with a wheel on the end of a drill to create a kind of somewhat effective flywheel, and wood was essential in that. There'll be other components that you'll use for prototyping too, but wood is very effective and useful. So awesome. Yeah, I think that's our time for today. I want to say thank you very much for joining us, Sam. It was awesome to have you here with us, and thank you to Wealthsimple and everyone for being here today. We have our next and final seminar on December 8th on paying for post-secondary. So if you're interested in that, we hope to see you there. Otherwise, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and have a great day.